A door closed inside Nottingham Cottage on a spring evening in 2011. It was a narrow door set into a door frame so low that the man who had just walked through it, the second in line to the British throne, had long ago learned to duck. The ceilings above were timbered and close. The staircase that rose from the small hall turned sharply on itself, the treads worn shallow by 3 centuries of feet. Outside, beyond a modest patch of garden, the bulk of Kensington Palace stood in the dusk, its state apartments unlit. Inside, in a kitchen barely larger than that of a comfortable London flat, a kettle was set on a hob. A 29-year-old woman from Berkshire, married 8 days, listened to the silence of a house that was now, in some unfamiliar sense, hers. The contrast with the room she had stood in a few hours earlier, on her wedding evening, the gold-leafed ballroom of Buckingham Palace, with its 30-foot ceilings and its painted ceiling roundels, and its uniformed footmen lining the walls, could hardly have been more complete. The world had watched her cross Westminster Abbey on the morning of the 29th of April. The world had watched her step onto the balcony in the early afternoon and lean in for the kiss the photographers had waited a decade to take. The world had then turned to other news, satisfied that the fairy tale was filed. What the world had not watched, because the world was not invited, was the moment a few weeks later when the cameras were truly gone and the front door of a 2-bedroom cottage on the back lots of Kensington shut behind her, and the household she had married into revealed itself to be not a palace at all, but a workshop, with a small staff and a low budget and a great quantity of unspoken expectations. This is the story the public was never given. It was not a story of scandal. There was no debauchery behind that door, no glittering decadence, nothing of the kind that the tabloid imagination required. It was something less marketable and rather more interesting. It was the story of a young woman walking into the oldest functioning monarchy in Europe with no entourage, no stylist on permanent retainer, no chef, no butler, no lady-in-waiting in the historic sense of the term, and no aristocratic instinct for command. It was the story of the household she and her husband chose to build, and of what that choice would cost them and protect them from, across the decade and more that followed. The first correction the record requires is one of timeline. The wedding night itself was not spent inside Kensington. The couple slept that evening at Buckingham Palace, in the apartment kept for visiting royalty in the Belgian suite, after the reception hosted by the Queen and the later party hosted by Prince Charles. The following days were a brief lull in London, then the honeymoon, taken in deep privacy on a private island in the Seychelles in May of 2011. The sustained first period inside Kensington as a married woman came only after that, in the early summer weeks when the couple began to use Nottingham Cottage as their London foothold. Their primary home in that year, and for some time afterwards, was not in London at all. It was a rented farmhouse on the island of Anglesey, off the northwest coast of Wales, near RAF Valley, where William was flying Sea King search and rescue helicopters for the Royal Air Force. The cottage at Kensington was the pied-à-terre. It was the place to which she returned when official business required a London address. It was, in every practical sense, the door through which her new life entered her. To understand what passed through that door, one has to understand who she was when she crossed it. Catherine Elizabeth Middleton had grown up in Bucklebury, a village in Berkshire, the eldest daughter of Carol and Michael Middleton, former airline employees who had built a successful mail-order party supplies business called Party Pieces from a shed behind the family home. The Middletons were prosperous, comfortable, self-made. They were not aristocrats, they were not titled. They had sent their children to good schools because they had earned the means to do so, not because tradition required it. Catherine had met William at the University of St Andrews in Scotland in 2001. They had been a couple, on and off, for 9 years before the engagement. They had separated, briefly and publicly, in the spring of 2007, an episode she had endured under a quality of press scrutiny that few private citizens of her age had ever experienced. She had emerged from it composed. She had emerged from it, by the accounts of those who knew her then, harder than she looked. The household she was marrying into in 2011 was, on paper, the most established in the world. Queen Elizabeth II sat on the throne in the 59th year of her reign. Prince Charles and Camilla, Duchess of Cornwall, kept court at Clarence House along the Mall. Prince Harry, then in his 20s, was sharing the wider Kensington grounds with his brother, his own bachelor lodgings tucked behind a different gate. Around the young couple themselves, a small advisory circle had begun to form, drawn partly from the diplomatic and military worlds. Sir David Manning, a former British ambassador to Washington, had been brought in as an informal foreign affairs advisor. Jamie Lowther Pinkerton, a former Special Air Service officer, served as the principal private secretary to William, Catherine and Harry jointly. Helen Asprey, a long-serving member of the royal household, handled the personal affairs of the household, the correspondence, the diary, the quiet logistics by which a royal day is assembled. That was, more or less, the whole apparatus. Compared with the courts kept by the Queen at Buckingham Palace and by Charles at Clarence House, it was almost nothing. It was, by deliberate design, a small office attached to a small home. What follows draws on the accounts of those who watched her cross that threshold and stayed near enough to remember it. The reporting of Katie Nicholl, whose book on Catherine appeared in 2013, the later work of Robert Lacey on the brothers and their separation, Tina Brown's account of the wider palace world in 2022. Above all, the meticulous staff-level reporting of Valentine Lowe, whose book on the courtiers of the modern monarchy, also published in 2022, drew on interviews with the household workers and private secretaries who passed through the Cambridge orbit across the decade. What those accounts return to, again and again, is the smallness of the operation in those first months, and the silence of the cottage, and a young woman alone in its kitchen while the household telephone rang through, unanswered by her, to an aide who was somewhere else entirely, and the recognition settled, slowly and without ceremony, that there was no longer any version of her life that did not pass through that door. Catherine, alone in the small kitchen of Nottingham Cottage, on her first quiet evening back from honeymoon, the household phone ringing through to an aide somewhere else, the realization settling that there was no longer any version of her life that did not pass through that door. That door, and the rooms behind it, deserve a closer look, because almost everything that came afterwards was shaped by the scale of what she had walked into. Nottingham Cottage sits tucked behind the main wings of Kensington Palace, a brick building dating from the 1690s and attributed to the office of Sir Christopher Wren. It had been built as ancillary accommodation, not as a residence of state. The rooms are small. The ceilings are low. The door frames are lower still, low enough that William, who stands 6'3", was known by household staff to strike his head when distracted. There are 2 bedrooms. There is a modest kitchen, a sitting room, a narrow staircase, a small garden behind. There is no grand entrance hall. There are no staterooms. There is no ballroom, no gallery, no enfilade of reception rooms hung with old masters. The painted front door opens almost directly onto a path. The public, in the spring of 2011, was picturing something quite different. The phrase Kensington Palace carried with it the freight of 3 centuries of royal residence, of Queen Victoria's birthplace, of Princess Margaret's famously theatrical household across the courtyard. When newspapers wrote that the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge were living at Kensington Palace, readers imagined grandeur. The reality was a two-bedroom cottage that would, in any other context, have been described as a comfortable mews house. This gap between the words on the page and the rooms behind the door is where the staff observations begin, and they begin with the simple question of how many people were actually working for the new royal couple. Valentine Lowe, in his 2022 book Courtiers, reconstructed the early Cambridge household in some detail. The team was, by the standards of senior royals, strikingly lean. A housekeeper, a part-time dresser, private secretaries who were shared with Prince Harry, then living a few hundred yards away on the same Kensington grounds. Jamie Lowther Pinkerton handled the formal side. Helen Asprey looked after personal affairs. Sir David Manning, the former ambassador to Washington, served as an outside advisor on the bigger questions of foreign travel and constitutional positioning. There was no butler, there was no chef in permanent residence. Catherine, by several accounts gathered by Lowe and by Katie Nicholl in her 2013 biography, Kate, the Future Queen, cooked many of her own meals during those first months in the cottage, often for William when he was down from Anglesey, often alone when he was not. The smallness of the household produced its own immediate puzzle, which was the question of what to call her. Inside a royal residence, a dress is not a matter of casual preference. It is a code that signals where a person stands in the hierarchy and how the household is to function around them. Catherine arrived as Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Cambridge, and in formal settings she was Ma'am, pronounced to rhyme with jam, after the first Your Royal Highness of the day. But the staff at Nottingham Cottage were operating at a scale where the formal settings and the kitchen settings were the same 3 rooms. Reporting from Lowe and from Tina Brown, whose 2022 book The Palace Papers drew on a wide range of household sources, suggests that Catherine quietly accepted Catherine within the house, among those who worked closely with her, Ma'am, at the formal moments, and that she did not insist on protocol with junior staff. The housekeeper was not required to curtsy each time the Duchess passed through the kitchen. This sounds like a small thing. It was not. To understand why, one has to look across the courtyard at the ghost of the household that had occupied apartment 1A until 2002. Princess Margaret had lived in that apartment, the large 4-story residence that Catherine and William would later move into, for decades. Margaret's household was remembered by long-serving Kensington staff, some of whom were still on the wider estate when Catherine arrived, as run on a different planet of formality. Margaret rang for breakfast in bed at set times. She expected cocktails at 6. Her page knew the precise composition of her preferred whiskey and water. Her dressers laid out clothes for occasions she had not yet decided to attend. The household ran on hierarchy, on ritual, on the assumption that a princess of the blood did not make her own tea. Catherine made her own tea. The contrast was not lost on the older staff, who spoke, on the usual conditions of anonymity, to Tina Brown and to others reporting on the new household. Some of them found the change refreshing. Some found it disorienting. A few, by Brown's account, found it slightly unserious, as though the institution itself were being diluted by domestic habits more appropriate to a Berkshire farmhouse than to a royal palace. It is important to say clearly what this informality was and what it was not. It was not classlessness, and it was not naivety. It was, by the consistent account of multiple writers who have examined the household, a deliberate strategy, and the strategist was largely William. He had watched, as a boy, his mother's household at Kensington become first a stage and then a battleground. Diana's staff had leaked. Her butlers had written books. Her private secretaries had taken sides in the War of the Waleses. The lesson William drew from the 1990s, and the lesson he applied from his wedding day onward, was simple. Keep the circle small. Keep the leaks impossible by keeping the leakers few. Keep the family unit, not the institution, at the centre of daily life. A household of 3 cannot produce the kind of poisonous internal politics that a household of 30 can. Onto this small, deliberately tight household came a presence that had no precedent in modern royal practice, and that presence was Catherine's mother. Carol Middleton, born in Ealing to a working-class family, founder with her husband Michael of the party supplies business that had made the family wealthy, was a regular visitor to Nottingham Cottage from the earliest weeks. She drove up from Bucklebury. She often stayed. She helped with the domestic organisation of a residence that, for all its royal address, was running essentially as the household of a young married couple who both had demanding jobs and very little support. The staff noticed. The wider courtier class noticed too. Several senior figures in the broader royal household, by Lowe's reporting in Courtiers, found Carol's embeddedness inside Kensington uncomfortable. There was no tradition for it. A mother-in-law from outside the aristocracy, present in a royal residence as a matter of routine rather than invitation, did not fit any template they recognised. William and Catherine held firm. Carol continued to come. Carol continued to stay. The decision, looking back, set a pattern that would define the next decade and more. The Middletons, not the wider royal family, were the people Catherine turned to for the ordinary scaffolding of life. The cottage door, when it opened more often for Carol and for Pippa than for any Windsor relative. Through the second half of 2011, a rhythm settled. William was stationed at RAF Valley on Anglesey, flying Sea King helicopters as a search and rescue pilot. The couple's actual primary home, the place where they spent most nights, was a rented farmhouse on the island. Nottingham Cottage functioned as a London foothold, used when engagements required it, used when William was on leave and the couple wanted to be in the capital. Catherine had no fixed working diary in the modern sense. She was being eased into public duties slowly, a decision taken jointly by the couple and by Lowther Pinkerton, in conscious reaction to the speed at which Diana had been thrown into the deep end in 1981. The press, denied a substantive working schedule to cover, focused on her clothes. Coat dresses, hats, the dress she had worn to a charity gala. Reporters at engagements asked her, repeatedly, what designer she was wearing. The serious questions, about what she actually intended to do with the role, would come later, and when they came, they would not always be answered to the satisfaction of those asking. Late in 2011, a visiting aide arrived at Nottingham Cottage for a meeting on the diary. Catherine came down the narrow stair to greet them. She was dressed in jeans. The cottage around her was quiet. The household supporting her was smaller than that of many wealthy private families in London, smaller than that of certain bankers in Notting Hill, smaller than that of any senior royal in living memory. Inside the palace bureaucracy, a question was already beginning to form, asked quietly in corridors at Buckingham Palace and at Clarence House. Was this sustainable? Or was it a holding pattern, a temporary arrangement that would have to give way, sooner or later, to something grander, something more institutional, something that looked, from the outside, more like what a future queen was supposed to be? Late 2011, Catherine descending the narrow stair of Nottingham Cottage to greet a visiting aide, dressed not in couture but in jeans. The household around her smaller than that of many wealthy private families, and the question already forming inside the palace bureaucracy: was this sustainable, or was it a holding pattern? The question had a deadline, even if no one inside the cottage was willing to say so out loud. 2012 was approaching, and 2012 would not permit a young royal couple to drift. The Diamond Jubilee was scheduled for June, 60 years of Queen Elizabeth II on the throne, and every working member of the family would be required on parade. Catherine, barely a year married, was about to be measured against the institution in a way the cottage had so far insulated her from. The first solo engagements came that spring. They were modest by design. A visit to a children's hospice in Ipswich, a speech, her first in public, brief and audibly nervous. The press treated each one as a verdict, and the verdicts were generally kind. But staff around her noted something the cameras did not catch. The preparation was almost entirely her own. There was no speech-writing department of the kind that surrounded the Prince of Wales at Clarence House. There was Jamie Lowther Pinkerton, there was Helen Asprey, there was a typed brief, and there was Catherine at the kitchen table of Nottingham Cottage, rewriting paragraphs in longhand the night before. Then came September 2012, and the model the cottage had been built around was tested by something it could not control. A French photographer, using a long lens from a distant roadside, took photographs of Catherine sunbathing topless at a private chateau in Provence. The pictures appeared first in the French magazine Closer, then elsewhere. The household response was unusually swift and unusually angry. Legal action followed in France. William, by several accounts, took the intrusion as confirmation of everything he had inherited from his mother's experience, that the press, given an inch, would take a life. The episode hardened a tendency that was already there. The circle around the couple tightened further. The instinct to retreat behind the cottage door, to share less, to trust fewer, was not invented in September 2012, but it was reinforced. 3 months later, in December, the household was forced into another disclosure it had not planned. Catherine was admitted to the King Edward VII Hospital in London with hyperemesis gravidarum, an acute pregnancy sickness. The announcement of her pregnancy came earlier than the couple had intended, dictated by the hospitalization rather than by any considered communications plan. The pregnancy itself changed the arithmetic of the cottage. 2 bedrooms, low Wren-era ceilings, a small garden. A baby was coming. The holding pattern had run out of room. The decision to move across the Kensington Palace grounds to apartment 1A had in fact been taken some time earlier, but the practical pressure now accelerated it. Apartment 1A was, by any measure, a different proposition entirely. 4 stories, more than 20 rooms. The former London residence of Princess Margaret, who had died there in 2002, after which the apartment had stood largely unused for a decade, its grand interiors dating from a period when royal households were staffed in the manner of small hotels. The renovation was substantial, reported at £4.5 million of public funds for structural work, including the removal of asbestos, the replacement of wiring and roofing, and the reconfiguration of rooms that had not been touched since the 1960s. The couple paid privately for fittings, decoration, and furnishings. The work ran through 2012 and into 2013. They moved in that autumn, with Prince George, who had been born on the 22nd of July 2013, at the Lindo wing of St Mary's Hospital in Paddington, already a few months old. Moving day, for those staff who witnessed it, was a study in contrast. The Cambridges had been operating until that point out of a 2-bedroom cottage with a housekeeper and a part-time dresser. They were now opening the doors of a residence whose previous occupant had run a household of multiple full-time servants, with set hours for breakfast trays and dressing and drinks. The scale of apartment 1A required, by any practical reckoning, a substantially expanded team. The expansion happened, but cautiously. Antonella Fresalone, who had served the Queen at Buckingham Palace as a housemaid for more than a decade, transferred into the new household. Jessie Webb, William's own childhood nanny, came out of retirement to help with Prince George in the first months. The full-time Spanish nanny, who would become a fixture of the household, Maria Teresa Turrion Borrallo, joined from Norland College shortly after. A small number of additional domestic staff were brought in. There was, eventually, a cook for formal occasions. There was not, by the standards of either Princess Margaret's old household or of comparable European royal residences, a butler in the traditional sense. What staff who arrived at apartment 1A consistently noted was that the habits of Nottingham Cottage did not stay behind in Nottingham Cottage. Catherine continued to cook family meals when no engagement intervened. The school runs, when George and later Charlotte and Louis began nursery and prep school, were done by Catherine herself wherever possible. Reporting from Katie Nicholl and others through the mid-2010s returned repeatedly to the same image. A princess in jeans and trainers at the school gate, a mother making tea in her own kitchen, a household that had grown in square footage without growing in formality. The refusal of a lady-in-waiting, in the older sense, was part of this. The traditional model, embodied by the women who had served the Queen and the Queen Mother for decades, was a quasi-aristocratic companion who organised diaries, correspondence, and personal life, often unpaid, often from a similar social background. Catherine's household preferred the modern title of private secretary, with a small functional staff drawn on professional rather than social grounds. The shift was deliberate, and it was noticed. It was not, however, frictionless. Valentine Lowe's reporting in Courtiers, published in 2022, documented something the public-facing image rarely admitted: the strain on staff turnover in the Cambridge and later Wales household across the decade. Long hours, blurred lines between the professional and the personal. The difficulty inherent in a workplace that was also someone's family home, with small children moving through it with no clear shift end. Several private secretaries departed within relatively short tenures. The household acquired a reputation, in courtier circles, for being demanding to serve. Not unkind, by most accounts, but demanding. The door itself, meanwhile, was becoming a metaphor the staff understood instinctively. The wider Kensington Palace complex contained apartments occupied by other royals and by grace and favour residents whose families had been granted use of palace accommodation across generations. The convention, the unwritten rule, was that one front door's business was strictly not another's. Staff did not gossip between apartments. Mail did not cross thresholds. Visitors to one residence did not casually call at another. The palace functioned, in effect, as a terrace of independent households that happened to share a postcode and a security perimeter. This convention would acquire a particular resonance later. In 2017, Prince Harry, and from 2018, the newly married Sussexes, would occupy Nottingham Cottage themselves, the same 2-bedroom former servants' lodging Catherine had entered as a bride 6 years earlier. The cottage that had shaped the Cambridge model would shape, in very different ways, the brief and unhappy royal life of Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. The contrast between the two households that lived in the same small building at different moments would, in retrospect, become instructive. One had used the cottage as a foundation for opacity and survival. The other had found the same low ceilings unbearable and said so publicly after leaving. What the first night door closing of 2011 had begun was, in plain terms, a model. A royal household built on opacity, on family insulation, on the deliberate refusal of the Margaret-era grandeur that the building itself still whispered of from its panelling and its plasterwork. The decision was not articulated as doctrine. There was no memo. There were simply choices, made early, made consistently, and made by a couple who had watched what happened to a previous Princess of Wales when her household became porous. The choices had consequences the public would not see for another decade. They produced a working royal whose private life remained, to a degree unusual in the modern era, genuinely private. They produced children whose school friends did not appear in the tabloids. They produced an absence of memoirs, an absence of disaffected former staff selling stories, an absence of the leak culture that had defined Kensington Palace in the early 1990s. They also produced, eventually, a communications problem of a different kind, when illness arrived and the household's instinct for silence collided with a public that had grown accustomed to being told. Catherine, by the mid-2010s, walking her children through the same Kensington gardens she had first entered as a bride, the public seeing a polished duchess, the staff seeing a woman who still made her own tea, and the door of apartment 1A closing behind her exactly as the cottage door once had. Catherine, by the mid-2010s, walking her children through the same Kensington gardens she had first entered as a bride, the public seeing a polished duchess, the staff seeing a woman who still made her own tea, and the door of apartment 1A closing behind her exactly as the cottage door once had. That door would close again and again over the years that followed, in new houses, on new floors, under new titles, and each time the pattern set inside Nottingham Cottage in 2011 held. In the summer of 2022, the family left Kensington for Adelaide Cottage on the Windsor estate, a 4-bedroom house with no live-in staff. The decision drew comment in the press because it was, by any normal royal measure, small. There was no butler. The children went to a local school. The household, by then a Wales operation rather than a Cambridge one, remained leaner than its institutional weight suggested. 2 months later, on the 8th of September, Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral. William and Catherine became Prince and Princess of Wales the following day. The titles were the heaviest in the family after the crown itself. The domestic arrangements did not change. Then, in early 2024, came the test the entire architecture had been built, without anyone quite knowing it, to withstand. Catherine underwent abdominal surgery in January. In March, after weeks of speculation, a Mother's Day photograph released through the Wales household was withdrawn by international picture agencies on the grounds that it had been digitally altered. The silence that followed was filled, as silences in the modern information environment always are, by other voices. On the 22nd of March, Catherine recorded a video statement, alone on a bench, disclosing a cancer diagnosis and a course of preventative chemotherapy. What is striking, looking back at that period with the staff history in mind, is what did not happen. No household member spoke. No former private secretary surfaced with a version of events. No nurse, no driver, no protection officer leaked a timeline. For an institution that has, over decades, produced a steady output of tell-all memoirs and weekend exclusives, the quiet around the Princess of Wales in 2024 was extraordinary. It was also not accidental. It was the dividend of choices made 13 years earlier in a two-bedroom cottage, when a young couple decided that the circle would be small, the contracts would be tight, and the family unit would be the unit that mattered. The Margaret-era model, the one whispered about by the older staff who remembered apartment 1A in its previous incarnation, would not have survived this. A household of 40 cannot keep a secret. A household of 4, properly chosen and properly bound, can. The first night inside Kensington in 2011, with one housekeeper and a kettle, contained the seed of the silence of 2024. If this account has been useful, subscribing to the channel costs nothing, and there are more stories like this one queued. The bell notification means you will see them when they go up. The counter reading, which any honest account has to make, is that opacity exacts its own price. The same closed door that protects a woman undergoing chemotherapy also closes on legitimate questions about the public funds that maintain her residences, the institutional decisions made in her name, and the workings of a monarchy that is, in the end, a public office. The edited Mother's Day photograph was a small thing in itself. What it revealed was larger. A household so practiced in controlling its image that it had begun to assume the image could simply be made rather than recorded. The video statement that followed was effective precisely because it abandoned the management and returned to the woman. The lesson, if the household chose to learn it, was that silence works only up to the point where the public requires speech, and that the line between the two is not drawn inside the palace. The staff who watched all of this, the ones who carried trays and answered phones and stood in corridors through the decade and more, have largely kept their counsel. The reporting that exists, the work of Katie Nicholl and Robert Lacey and Tina Brown and Valentine Lowe, is built on fragments, on courtiers willing to speak only on background, on the careful triangulation of small details. There is no Catherine equivalent of the Diana tapes. There is no household memoir. The through line, from the housekeeper of 2011 to the private secretaries of the present Wales office, has been a workforce trained to see and not to say. Whether one calls that discipline or secrecy depends on where one stands in relation to the door. And here is the strange thing, the thing that distinguishes this story from most of the ones told on this channel. The gap between image and reality, in Catherine's case, runs the wrong way. The public image is grander than the private truth. The fairy tale princess goes home and cooks pasta. The palace, for the first 2.5 years of her married life, was a cottage with low ceilings that her husband kept walking into. The court was a housekeeper, a part-time dresser, 2 shared private secretaries, and a mother-in-law from Berkshire who drove up the M4 with shopping bags. The balcony at Buckingham Palace, the carriage down the Mall, the 20-room apartment that eventually came, none of these were the texture of her actual days. The texture of her actual days was domestic, narrow, and quietly defended. That defence is the achievement, for those who count it as one, and the evasion for those who do not. It does not resolve into a single verdict. A woman entitled to a private life, married into an institution whose entire premise is publicity, and spent the next decade and more trying to hold a line that the institution itself was not designed to hold.